Something rather unsettling has quietly resurfaced behind the polished doors of the British monarchy. Meghan Markle has revealed that, during a return to Frogmore Cottage, she stumbled upon a deeply personal diary she once kept while living inside the royal system, pages filled, it seems, during some of the most turbulent and emotionally charged months of her life, and according to someone close to palace circles, the mere suggestion that those handwritten reflections still exist has stirred a ripple of unease among those who remember exactly what those years felt like from the inside. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. Now, one must understand why such a simple object, a notebook, nothing more dramatic than ink on paper, can create such quiet anxiety within an institution that has survived wars, abdications, scandals, and the relentless scrutiny of the modern media age. Diaries, you see, are dangerous in a way that official interviews and television appearances are not. They are not shaped by advisors, polished by lawyers, or filtered through the careful machinery of royal communications. A diary captures the moment as it was felt, not as it was later explained. And if Meghan truly recorded her thoughts while living at Frogmore Cottage, while adjusting to royal life, while navigating tensions both public and private, then those pages may contain the kind of raw, unedited emotion that the monarchy has always preferred remain safely out of view. A well-placed source quietly remarked that the palace reaction was not explosive outrage, but something far more telling, a deep, contemplative silence, because once something like that exists, it cannot be unknowingly erased. The story, according to someone familiar with the circumstances, begins during the period when Meghan and Prince Harry briefly returned to the United Kingdom around the time of the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. Their relationship with the royal household was already strained, the atmosphere cautious and somewhat brittle, as if every conversation carried the faint possibility of reopening old wounds. Frogmore Cottage, the modest but elegant residence gifted to the couple after their wedding, had by then become something of a symbol. Once envisioned as their peaceful home within the royal fold, it had gradually transformed into a reminder of promises that had not quite unfolded as planned. When Meghan reportedly went through boxes and belongings stored there, perhaps simply organizing old possessions before leaving once again, she apparently came across a notebook she had long forgotten about. And with that rediscovery came the sudden realization that she had, during those earlier years, written things down, very personal things. Imagine the moment for a second. You open an old drawer or forgotten storage box, and there it is. A diary you once filled with thoughts during a time when life felt overwhelming, confusing, perhaps even isolating. You begin to read, and suddenly the emotions of that period return with startling clarity. According to a long-time family acquaintance, Meghan's reaction was not merely nostalgic reflection, but something closer to astonishment at what she had recorded. Those entries, it is believed, date back to the period when she was still navigating the bewildering machinery of royal life, learning protocols, enduring constant press scrutiny, and attempting to find her place within an institution that has been evolving, slowly and sometimes painfully, for centuries. If that diary truly captured her private impressions of those experiences, then it may contain an unusually candid portrait of life inside the palace walls. Now, it would be easy to dismiss such a notebook as simply a personal artifact, something sentimental but ultimately harmless. Yet, royal history teaches us otherwise. Personal writings have often proven far more revealing than official records ever could be. The diaries of courtiers, private letters of monarchs, even small notes scribbled during moments of stress have decades later rewritten entire chapters of royal history. A source behind closed doors observed rather dryly that the monarchy's greatest vulnerability has never been scandal itself, because scandals come and go, but rather the documentation of how those scandals actually felt to the people living through them. In other words, the emotional truth behind events can be far more explosive than the events themselves, and this is precisely where the tension begins to simmer. Because Meghan Markle is no longer a junior royal bound by the same traditions of silence that governed previous generations. She lives thousands of miles away in California. She operates within a media environment that rewards personal storytelling, and she has already demonstrated, alongside Prince Harry, that the modern royal narrative is no longer controlled solely by Buckingham Palace. When someone like that rediscovers a diary written during her time within the institution, the implications become rather obvious. Those pages, intentionally or not, may form the skeleton of future revelations. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not even soon. But the possibility alone is enough to make certain figures within royal circles pause and wonder exactly what might be written there. Someone close to palace circles explained the concern in rather understated terms. It is not necessarily the fear that Meghan intends immediate revenge or dramatic exposure. Rather, it is the awareness that memories captured in writing have a peculiar permanence. They cannot be easily reinterpreted once they exist on paper. A diary entry written during a moment of frustration or hurt remains a snapshot of that exact emotion, preserved indefinitely. And if those emotions were directed toward specific individuals, specific moments, or specific decisions made within the royal household, then those written reflections could one day challenge the carefully curated public narrative that has surrounded the Sussex departure for years. What makes the situation particularly intriguing is that Meghan herself reportedly acknowledged the diary in a somewhat casual manner during conversation about her time at Frogmore Cottage. There was no dramatic declaration, no theatrical threat, just a quiet remark that she had rediscovered the notebook and that it contained thoughts from that intense chapter of her life. Yet, as someone familiar with royal dynamics pointed out, sometimes the most unsettling statements are the calmest ones. A casual remark about a forgotten diary can echo far more loudly than an outright accusation, because it plants a question in the minds of observers, and once that question exists, it begins to grow. And so the monarchy finds itself confronting something rather unusual, not a public scandal, not a leaked photograph, not a political controversy, but the quiet existence of handwritten pages that may or may not contain deeply personal reflections about royal life. The institution has always relied heavily on discretion, on the idea that certain experiences remain within the family, within the walls of the palace, shared only among those who understand the unique pressures of that world. Yet, the modern era has a habit of dissolving those walls. Stories travel further, faster, and more persistently than ever before. A single memoir can reshape public perception. A handful of recorded memories can redefine entire relationships. And somewhere within that broader landscape of royal storytelling now sits a small, rather ordinary diary. One that Meghan Markle once wrote in the privacy of her home at Frogmore Cottage, believing perhaps that those words would never travel beyond its pages. Whether it remains merely a personal keepsake or eventually evolves into something far more consequential is, for the moment, impossible to know. But the simple fact that it exists has already stirred curiosity among observers and quiet reflection within palace corridors. Because if history has taught us anything about royal secrets, it is that the most revealing stories rarely begin with grand announcements. More often, they begin exactly like this, with a forgotten notebook rediscovered in an old house filled with memories. Frogmore Cottage, the quiet residence tucked away within the Windsor estate, has always carried an atmosphere rather different from the grander royal properties. It was never Buckingham Palace with its gilded corridors or Windsor Castle with its centuries of ceremonial gravity. Instead, Frogmore felt smaller, more intimate, almost deceptively ordinary by royal standards. Yet that modest house would become the setting for one of the most emotionally complicated chapters in modern royal history. When Meghan Markle and Prince Harry first moved there after their wedding, the property symbolized hope, a fresh beginning inside the monarchy, a private sanctuary where they could build a life away from relentless public scrutiny. And yet, according to someone within the inner circle, the house would eventually become something else entirely, a place where expectations quietly collided with reality. At the beginning, the narrative surrounding Frogmore Cottage was almost idyllic. The home had been gifted to the couple as part of their new life together, and extensive renovations were undertaken to transform the building into a comfortable family residence. The press spoke about fresh interiors, modern design, and the promise of a peaceful domestic space within the royal estate. To outside observers, the story appeared simple and charming, a young royal couple settling into married life. But life within the royal orbit rarely remains simple for long. Behind the scenes, the pressures of royal duty, media scrutiny, and institutional tradition began pressing in from every direction. A longtime family acquaintance later suggested that the early months inside Frogmore were not marked by dramatic explosions, but by something more subtle, a steady accumulation of tension. For Meghan, the transition into royal life was never going to be effortless. She had entered an institution built upon centuries of tradition, where every movement, every phrase, every public appearance was filtered through an intricate system of expectations. To many observers, it seemed as though she was adapting quickly, learning royal protocol, participating in engagements, supporting charitable causes. Yet, someone familiar with palace dynamics described a quieter reality unfolding behind the scenes. There were constant lessons to absorb, endless briefings from palace staff, and a relentless awareness that the smallest misstep could generate headlines across the world. For someone who had previously enjoyed a degree of personal independence, the adjustment could feel overwhelming. It was during this period, according to a well-meaning staff member, that Meghan may have begun writing regularly in the diary she later rediscovered. Journaling, after all, is often the refuge of people navigating unfamiliar environments. It allows thoughts to be expressed freely, without judgment, without immediate consequence. In the privacy of Frogmore Cottage, away from cameras and palace advisors, those pages may have become a quiet companion during moments when the pressure of royal life felt particularly heavy. Imagine the late evenings inside that house, the formal engagements finished, the staff gone home, the world outside finally silent. In those moments, it is easy to picture someone opening a notebook and writing down what the day had truly felt like. Someone close to palace circles observed that this private habit may have served another purpose as well. In environments where one feels misunderstood or misrepresented, writing things down can create a sense of control. The act of recording events, who said what, how conversations unfolded, what emotions were felt, becomes a way of preserving one's version of reality. It is not necessarily a strategic move at the time. More often it is simply an emotional release. But over time, those small entries accumulate. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and suddenly a diary contains a detailed chronicle of a life chapter that might otherwise fade into blurred memory. Inside Frogmore Cottage, the Sussexes' life gradually became more complicated. Media attention intensified, often sharply critical. Rumors circulated about tensions within the royal household. Palace aides were reportedly navigating an increasingly delicate situation, trying to balance the expectations of tradition with the personalities of a modern royal couple. According to a source behind closed doors, the atmosphere inside the broader royal system during those months could sometimes feel strained, even brittle. Every public appearance was dissected, every family interaction was interpreted through layers of speculation. And through it all, the quiet house at Frogmore remained the place where Meghan and Harry retreated at the end of each day. For Meghan, the contrast between public image and private experience may have been particularly striking. The world saw glamorous photographs, elegant ceremonies, and carefully choreographed royal events. Yet life inside the institution involved a constant negotiation between personal identity and royal expectation. A longtime family acquaintance suggested that this tension was perhaps the defining feature of Meghan's early royal experience. She was not simply adjusting to a new family, she was adjusting to an entire system designed long before she arrived. In such circumstances, the diary becomes more than a personal notebook. It becomes a quiet witness to the emotional landscape unfolding behind closed doors. And that is precisely why the rediscovery of those pages has generated such fascination today. Because Frogmore Cottage was not merely a residence, it was the stage upon which the Sussex story began to shift. The optimism of a royal wedding gradually gave way to frustration, misunderstanding, and ultimately departure from royal duties altogether. If Meghan's diary truly captured her thoughts during those crucial months, then it may contain something uniquely revealing, not the polished narrative delivered in interviews or documentaries, but the immediate impressions of someone living through the storm in real time. One must remember that history often turns on such seemingly small artifacts. Letters, journals, private reflections, these are the documents that later historians use to understand what people were truly thinking when public events unfolded. In the case of Frogmore Cottage, the diary represents exactly that kind of artifact. It is a quiet object connected to a house that once symbolized royal harmony and later came to represent one of the most dramatic departures in modern royal history. And somewhere within those pages may lie the emotional map of how that transformation occurred, how a hopeful beginning inside the monarchy slowly evolved into one of its most complicated and controversial chapters. If one pauses for a moment and considers what a private diary truly represents, it becomes rather clear why the rediscovered notebook at Frogmore Cottage has sparked such curiosity. A diary is not written for the public, it is written for the self. And that means the tone inside those pages is rarely diplomatic, rarely cautious, and certainly not crafted for royal protocol. Someone behind closed doors described it rather bluntly. A diary captures the version of events people record when they believe nobody will ever challenge them. That is precisely what makes such documents so revealing. If Meghan Markle truly chronicled her experiences during those volatile early years inside the monarchy, then the diary may well serve as a silent witness to moments that were never meant to leave the walls of royal residences. Consider the period when Meghan first entered royal life. From the outside, it appeared dazzling. Grand ceremonies, state occasions, a wedding watched by millions around the world. Yet behind the glittering facade, royal life operates according to rules that are both rigid and deeply entrenched. Every conversation is shaped by hierarchy. Every decision passes through layers of protocol. For someone entering that system as an outsider, the experience can feel like stepping into a centuries-old machine whose gears have been turning long before you arrived. According to a longtime family acquaintance, Meghan quickly realized that the monarchy functions less like a family and more like an institution. That distinction, subtle as it may seem, can transform the way personal interactions unfold. Now, imagine those early weeks inside palace corridors, the polite smiles, the carefully worded guidance from palace aides, the quiet reminders about tradition and expectation. On the surface, everything may have appeared perfectly cordial. But in environments built upon hierarchy, tension often hides beneath impeccable manners. A well-meaning staff member once suggested that disagreements within royal households rarely resemble dramatic arguments. Instead, they emerge through gestures, silences, and subtle signals that communicate far more than direct words ever could. If Meghan was recording her impressions during those moments, the diary may contain descriptions of those small but powerful encounters. One can easily picture an entry written late at night after a difficult day of engagements, perhaps a remark that felt dismissive, a meeting that ended in frustration, a sense that the newcomer in the room was expected to adapt far more quickly than anyone had prepared her for. In ordinary families, such moments might pass quickly. But within the royal household, every misunderstanding carries wider implications. According to someone close to palace circles, the early Sussex period was marked by an atmosphere of careful observation. Senior figures were watching how Meghan adapted. Palace aides were adjusting strategies, and Meghan herself was learning that the monarchy does not easily bend to individual personalities. It is within that context that the diary becomes particularly intriguing, because diaries often capture not only events, but emotional interpretations of those events. What felt like a minor exchange to one person might appear deeply significant to another. A conversation remembered casually by palace staff might feel intensely personal to someone still trying to understand their place within the system. According to a source behind closed doors, the early months of Meghan's royal life were filled with precisely these kinds of interpretive gaps. Different people experienced the same moments in entirely different ways. As time passed, the external pressure only intensified. the media began dissecting Meghan's every appearance, sometimes with striking hostility. Headlines grew sharper, public commentary became more polarized. And inside the palace, advisors were working overtime attempting to manage the narrative while maintaining traditional royal restraint. For Meghan, the effect was reportedly disorienting. A longtime family acquaintance suggested that the feeling of being simultaneously scrutinized and misunderstood can create a powerful sense of isolation. When someone feels that their public story is being told incorrectly, the instinct to record the truth privately becomes almost irresistible. That is where the diary may have evolved from a simple journal into something more deliberate, not necessarily a calculated document for future exposure, at least not at first, but rather a record of events as Meghan experienced them, a place where she could write, freely and without interruption, what each day inside the monarchy truly felt like. Who said what? How situations unfolded? What emotions were left unsaid during formal conversations? Over time, such entries accumulate into something remarkable, a chronological account of life within one of the most guarded institutions on earth. Someone within the inner circle once remarked that the monarchy relies heavily on controlled narratives. Public statements are measured, appearances are choreographed, conflicts are resolved quietly whenever possible. But a diary does not operate within that system. It exists outside the machinery of royal communications. It records impressions exactly as they occurred, not as they were later explained. And if Meghan's diary indeed spans those early Sussex months, it may contain descriptions of moments that the palace would very much prefer remain private. Of course, it is impossible to know precisely what those pages contain. They may include simple reflections on royal events, personal frustrations, or emotional reactions to the extraordinary pressures of palace life. But the very uncertainty surrounding the diary is what gives it such power. Because within royal history, the most disruptive revelations often come not from dramatic confrontations, but from quiet documentation. Letters discovered decades later, journals found in forgotten drawers, personal writings that suddenly illuminate the hidden tensions behind public events. And if Meghan Markle's diary truly captured the emotional landscape of her time inside the monarchy, those early months at Frogmore Cottage when optimism slowly gave way to strain, then the notebook represents more than a personal artifact. It becomes a kind of historical witness, a private chronicle of royal life written by someone who experienced the institution not as a distant observer, but as a participant navigating its most intimate corridors. Whether those pages ever become public is another question entirely, but for now, the possibility alone continues to hover quietly over the royal story like a sealed envelope whose contents remain known only to the person who wrote them. By the time the Sussex story reached its most dramatic turning point, the atmosphere within royal circles had become unmistakably tense. What had begun as a hopeful modern chapter for the monarchy, an American actress joining one of the world's most ancient institutions, had gradually evolved into something far more complicated. According to someone close to palace circles, the final months before Prince Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties felt less like a sudden crisis and more like the slow tightening of a knot. Conversations grew more delicate, public appearances were analyzed with increasing intensity, and behind the scenes, everyone involved seemed to sense that the situation was approaching a moment of irreversible change. Inside Frogmore Cottage, life during those final months was reportedly marked by a strange mixture of normal domestic routines and extraordinary pressure. There were still engagements to attend, official duties to perform, and the constant choreography of royal life. Yet the emotional atmosphere surrounding the Sussex household was shifting rapidly. A longtime family acquaintance described the period as one in which hope and frustration existed side by side. On certain days, there remained the belief that tensions could still be resolved, that misunderstandings might be cleared away through careful conversation. But on other days, the sense of distance between the Sussexes and the broader royal institution seemed to grow more pronounced. It is within that fragile atmosphere that Meghan's diary becomes particularly intriguing. If she was still recording her thoughts during those months, the entries may have captured the emotional turbulence of a couple trying to navigate an increasingly uncomfortable position within the monarchy. Imagine the pages written during that time. Reflections after difficult meetings, reactions to media headlines, private interpretations of family discussions whose details never reached the public. Someone behind closed doors once remarked that the most revealing diary entries are rarely written during calm periods. They are written when the writer feels misunderstood, cornered, or simply desperate to make sense of events unfolding too quickly to process. The pressures surrounding the Sussexes were indeed mounting rapidly. Media coverage had intensified to a relentless degree, with every gesture, every comment, every perceived misstep magnified across global headlines. Palace advisors were attempting to manage the situation carefully, balancing traditional royal restraint with the modern reality of a media environment that demanded constant narrative control. According to a well-placed source, this balancing act was becoming increasingly difficult. The Sussexes were modern public figures operating within a centuries-old institution that had never fully adapted to the speed and volatility of contemporary media. For Meghan, the experience reportedly felt particularly isolating. A well-meaning staff member later suggested that navigating royal life while simultaneously facing intense public criticism can create an emotional paradox. On one hand, the royal environment is surrounded by people, staff members, advisors, security personnel, family members. Yet on the other hand, the strict rules governing communication can leave individuals feeling remarkably alone. Personal frustrations cannot easily be expressed publicly. Internal disagreements must remain private. The result is a kind of emotional bottling up that, for many people, eventually seeks an outlet. In Meghan's case, that outlet may well have been the diary itself. Within the quiet rooms of Frogmore Cottage, away from cameras and palace protocol, those pages may have become a place where she could articulate what she was experiencing without restraint. The diary may have recorded moments when optimism briefly returned, when conversations with Prince Harry brought reassurance that their path forward was still open. But it may also have captured darker reflections, the growing realization that their vision of royal life was diverging sharply from the expectations of the institution surrounding them. One can imagine a particular entry written after a long and difficult discussion within palace corridors. Perhaps Meghan returned to Frogmore Cottage late in the evening, exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation. The house would have been quiet, the corridors dimly lit, the outside world momentarily distant. In that moment, the act of opening the diary and writing down what had just happened might have felt almost therapeutic. Words on paper have a peculiar ability to transform confusion into narrative. They allow events to be organized, emotions to be expressed, and experiences to be preserved exactly as they were felt. Meanwhile, within the palace itself, senior figures were grappling with an increasingly complex dilemma. King Charles, then still Prince of Wales, and other senior royals were attempting to preserve stability within the institution while addressing the concerns of the Sussexes. According to someone close to palace circles, these discussions were rarely simple. The monarchy, after all, is not merely a family. It is a constitutional institution intertwined with centuries of tradition, public expectation, and national symbolism. Decisions about the roles of its members are therefore never purely personal matters. And yet the Sussex situation was profoundly personal. Prince Harry, deeply protective of his wife, was reportedly growing increasingly frustrated with the media environment surrounding them. Meghan, navigating both royal protocol and intense public scrutiny, was attempting to reconcile her own identity with the expectations of royal life. A longtime family acquaintance suggested that the emotional strain of this dual struggle gradually reached a point where the couple began seriously considering alternatives to their existing role within the monarchy. When the announcement eventually came, Prince Harry and Meghan declaring their intention to step back from senior royal duties, it stunned observers around the world. But according to those familiar with the preceding months, the decision had been building quietly for some time. It was the culmination of countless conversations, frustrations, and reflections that had accumulated behind palace doors. And somewhere within Meghan's rediscovered diary, it is entirely possible that those reflections were recorded in real time. If that is indeed the case, then the diary may contain something uniquely powerful, a first-person account of the exact moment when the Sussex chapter of royal history began to fracture. Not the polished explanations offered later in interviews or documentaries, but the raw impressions of someone living through that turning point as it unfolded. Those pages may capture the uncertainty, the emotional turbulence, and perhaps even the sense of inevitability that accompanied the decision to step away from royal life. And that possibility alone, those quiet handwritten reflections from inside Frogmore Cottage, continues to cast a long and intriguing shadow over the royal narrative that followed. By the time the Sussex chapter of royal life reached its next turning point, Frogmore Cottage had already transformed from a hopeful marital home into something far more symbolic. What had once been presented to the public as a charming sanctuary for a newly married couple had gradually become, in the minds of many observers, a quiet reminder of a relationship between the Sussexes and the royal institution that had grown increasingly strained. And when the couple eventually stepped away from their roles as working royals, the house remained behind, like a silent witness to everything that had unfolded within its walls. According to someone within the inner circle, Frogmore Cottage was no longer simply a residence, it had become a chapter of royal history. The emotional significance of the house deepened when the question of its future arose. For a time, Frogmore Cottage technically remained the Sussexes' British base, even as Prince Harry and Meghan established their new life in California. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the property had changed. Royal life continued to move forward without them, and the palace itself was attempting to stabilize after one of the most turbulent modern royal episodes. A well-placed source observed that within royal institutions there is always a quiet instinct to restore equilibrium after disruption. Traditions reassert themselves, routines resume, and the machinery of monarchy continues its steady rhythm. Then came the moment that many saw as the final symbolic severing of the Sussex connection to the royal household, the request that Frogmore Cottage be vacated. The decision, while delivered in the measured language typical of palace communications, carried unmistakable emotional weight. To the outside world, it appeared administrative, simply the reallocation of a royal residence. But according to a longtime family acquaintance, the moment carried deeper significance for Prince Harry in particular. Frogmore had represented the last tangible link between his new life abroad and the physical landscape of the royal family he had grown up within. Imagine, for a moment, what it must feel like to hand back the keys to the place where you once believed your future within the monarchy would unfold, the house where you returned after engagements, where you imagined raising a family within royal tradition, where plans were once quietly discussed late into the evening. A well-meaning staff member suggested that such moments often carry a strange mixture of resignation and nostalgia. One understands that circumstances have changed, yet the emotional memory of what the place once represented remains vivid. It was during this reflective period, according to someone behind closed doors, that Meghan reportedly revisited some of the diary entries she had written during their time at Frogmore Cottage. The rediscovery of those pages did more than simply revive old memories. It reportedly brought back the emotional intensity of that entire chapter of their lives. A diary has a peculiar ability to transport its writer back to the precise emotional state in which the words were originally written. Read a passage years later, and suddenly the thoughts, frustrations, and hopes of that earlier moment reappear with surprising clarity. A longtime family acquaintance suggested that Meghan shared some of those reflections with Prince Harry during a quiet conversation while looking back on their time within the royal system. As he listened to the entries, written during those early confusing months when the couple were still attempting to navigate royal expectations, Harry reportedly reacted with visible emotion. It is not difficult to understand why. Those diary pages may have described moments he himself experienced, but perhaps never fully saw through Meghan's perspective at the time. Hearing those thoughts years later, after everything that had happened, could only deepen the emotional impact. According to someone close to palace circles, this is precisely why the diary has become such a fascinating element within the broader Sussex narrative. It represents something that interviews, documentaries, and even memoirs cannot fully replicate, a contemporaneous record. The words were written not with the benefit of hindsight, but in the middle of events as they unfolded. That difference matters enormously. Reflections written years later inevitably carry the influence of later experiences, shifting perceptions, and the passage of time. But a diary entry captures a moment exactly as it felt when it happened. For the palace, the existence of such a document inevitably raises questions, not necessarily of fear, but of uncertainty. The monarchy has always depended upon a delicate balance between transparency and discretion. Certain aspects of royal life are shared publicly, while others remain within the private sphere of the family. A diary written by someone who once stood inside that inner world sits in a curious position between those two realms. It is both deeply personal and potentially historically revealing. Someone within the inner circle remarked with a trace of dry humor that royal households throughout history have always been wary of personal documentation. Letters, journals, and memoirs have a habit of resurfacing at the most inconvenient moments. Sometimes they appear decades later in archives, sometimes they emerge unexpectedly through biographers or historians, and sometimes they become the foundation for narratives that reshape public understanding of events long after they occurred. In the case of Frogmore Cottage, the diary represents something even more unusual. It is not a relic from a distant royal era, but a document connected to a story that is still unfolding. The Sussex departure from royal duties remains a living narrative, with its consequences continuing to ripple through the institution. King Charles now presides over a monarchy navigating both tradition and modernity, while Prince William prepares for the responsibilities of the future. Yet, somewhere beyond the palace gates, in a different continent entirely, sits a notebook written during the precise moment when that royal trajectory shifted. And so, Frogmore Cottage remains, in many ways, the quiet epicenter of that transformation. The house itself may now belong fully to the past chapter of the Sussex story, but the memories recorded there continue to linger. Within the pages of Meghan's rediscovered diary may lie a deeply personal account of how that chapter truly felt from the inside. Whether those reflections remain private or one day find their way into the broader public narrative is impossible to know. But the simple fact that they exist ensures that the story of Frogmore Cottage and the emotional history written within its walls has not quite finished unfolding. By the time the Sussex story entered its next phase, something rather significant had changed within the broader royal narrative. For generations, the monarchy had relied on a very specific strategy when dealing with internal tensions: silence. Disagreements remained behind palace doors, misunderstandings were quietly resolved, and the public rarely saw the emotional machinery operating beneath the surface of royal life. But the modern era, as someone close to palace circles quietly observed, has introduced an entirely new force into the royal equation: the power of personal storytelling. And nowhere did that shift become more obvious than in the era of royal memoirs. When Prince Harry released his memoir, the impact was immediate and unmistakable. Royal books are nothing new, of course. Biographies and historical accounts have existed for centuries. But this was different. This was not the work of a historian reconstructing events from archives, nor a journalist piecing together royal anecdotes from distant sources. This was a first-person narrative written by someone who had lived inside the royal system from birth, someone who had walked the palace corridors, participated in private family conversations, and experienced the pressures of royal life in ways the public could only imagine. A longtime family acquaintance remarked that the book fundamentally altered how royal stories could be told. The reaction inside royal circles, according to someone behind closed doors, was less explosive than many observers expected. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic palace rebuttals. Instead, there was something far more characteristic of the monarchy: restraint. The institution has always understood that direct engagement with controversy often amplifies it. Silence, though sometimes frustrating to observers, has long been one of the monarchy's most effective tools. Yet, even within that silence, there was an undeniable recognition that the landscape had changed. Personal narrative, once tightly controlled by palace communications, had become an independent force. For Meghan Markle, this shift inevitably raised an intriguing possibility. If Prince Harry's memoir represented his personal account of life within the monarchy, then Meghan's rediscovered diary represented something perhaps even more intimate. A memoir is written with the benefit of hindsight, carefully structured and edited before publication. But a diary is written in real time. It captures thoughts exactly as they occurred, before events had fully unfolded, before explanations had been refined. According to a well-placed source, that difference is precisely why the existence of Meghan's diary continues to generate such curiosity among royal observers. Imagine the scenario for a moment. Within the Sussex household in California sits a notebook filled with reflections written during those intense early years inside the monarchy. Pages that may describe moments of confusion, frustration, or emotional strain as Meghan attempted to navigate royal expectations. Pages that might recount private conversations, impressions of palace dynamics, or simply the emotional toll of living under relentless public scrutiny. A source within the inner circle suggested that the diary may read less like a calculated political document and more like something deeply human, the thoughts of someone trying to understand an institution far older and more complex than anything she had previously encountered. What makes the situation particularly fascinating is the quiet power such a document holds in the modern media environment. Publishing houses today compete fiercely for authentic personal narratives, especially those connected to globally recognized institutions like the British monarchy. A memoir based on personal diaries is often considered the most compelling form of storytelling because it offers readers something they believe to be genuine, unfiltered emotion captured at the exact moment it was felt. A source behind closed doors remarked rather wryly that publishers understand this dynamic extremely well. Within palace circles, however, the potential implications are viewed through a very different lens. The monarchy has always relied on continuity and stability as its central strengths. Individual personalities come and go, generations pass, but the institution itself remains steady. Yet personal memoirs introduce something unpredictable into that structure. They shift the focus away from the institution and toward the experiences of individuals within it. And once those personal experiences are shared publicly, they inevitably shape how the institution itself is perceived. Someone close to palace circles described the situation with a touch of philosophical resignation. The monarchy, after all, cannot prevent former members of the royal family from telling their stories, nor can it easily challenge those stories without creating further controversy. The most it can do is continue performing its public role while allowing the storm of commentary to move elsewhere. In many ways, this quiet endurance has been the monarchy's survival strategy for centuries. And yet the presence of Meghan's diary introduces an element of suspense into the narrative that remains unresolved. Because, unlike a finished memoir, the diary represents potential rather than conclusion. It is a story that exists but has not yet been fully told. The pages remain private, their contents known only to the person who wrote them. That uncertainty gives the document an almost mythical quality within royal commentary. Observers speculate about what might be written there, what emotions might be recorded, what moments might be described from Meghan's perspective. According to a longtime family acquaintance, the Sussex story has always contained two parallel narratives. One is the official royal narrative, carefully measured, dignified, and focused on institutional continuity. The other is the personal narrative of the individuals who experience those events from within. When those two narratives diverge, the resulting tension becomes the subject of endless fascination. And in the case of Meghan Markle's rediscovered diary, that tension has taken on an almost symbolic form, because ultimately the diary represents something larger than a collection of handwritten pages. It represents the possibility that the Sussex story, far from being fully told, may still contain chapters waiting to be revealed. Whether those chapters ever become public is a question only Meghan herself can answer. But for now, the quiet existence of that notebook continues to linger at the edge of the royal narrative, like an unopened letter whose contents remain hidden, yet whose presence alone keeps curiosity alive. By this stage of the story, the diary Meghan Markle reportedly rediscovered has taken on a peculiar kind of symbolic power. It is no longer simply a notebook filled with personal reflections from her time at Frogmore Cottage. Instead, within royal commentary and among those who observe palace dynamics closely, it has begun to represent something much larger, a form of quiet leverage, not necessarily a weapon in the dramatic sense that tabloids enjoy imagining, but a reminder that personal testimony possesses a unique influence in modern public life. According to someone close to palace circles, the mere existence of such a document alters the emotional balance of the situation, even if its contents remain completely private. The British monarchy, after all, is built upon carefully managed narratives. For centuries, it has relied on a delicate choreography of appearances, statements, and traditions that collectively shape how the institution is perceived. Public events are designed to project continuity. Official communications are written with extreme precision. Even moments of crisis are handled through a mixture of restraint and carefully measured transparency. This system has allowed the monarchy to survive wars, political upheavals, and cultural revolutions. But what it has always struggled to manage are personal accounts from individuals who once stood inside that system and later stepped outside it. A well-placed source explained the dilemma rather elegantly. When a former royal chooses to speak publicly, the monarchy faces a paradox. It cannot easily contradict the personal experiences of someone who lived within the institution, yet it cannot openly confirm every claim either. The result is a curious form of strategic silence. The palace continues its duties, the royal family maintains its schedule of public engagements, and the institution quietly hopes that time will eventually soften the intensity of public fascination. Often, that strategy works. Attention shifts elsewhere, and the royal story continues along its familiar path. Yet the Sussex narrative has proven unusually persistent. Years after Prince Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, the public remains deeply interested in the emotional and personal dimensions of that decision. Why did the relationship between the couple and the institution deteriorate so dramatically? What exactly happened behind the scenes during those final months? What conversations took place that never reached the public record? These questions continue to circulate, partly because the story unfolded so publicly, and partly because the individuals involved remain prominent figures on the global stage. Within that environment, Meghan's diary occupies an intriguing position. It represents a potential source of answers to those lingering questions. According to someone behind closed doors, palace strategists understand that modern audiences place enormous value on authenticity. People want to hear directly from the individuals who experienced events rather than from institutional spokespeople. A diary, by its very nature, appears authentic. It suggests thoughts written without the expectation of publication, emotions recorded before the influence of hindsight or public debate. This is why, according to a longtime family acquaintance, the diary has gradually taken on the aura of something almost mythical in royal commentary. Observers speculate endlessly about what might be written inside it. Some imagine detailed accounts of palace tensions, while others believe the entries may simply contain personal reflections on the emotional challenges of royal life. In truth, only Meghan herself knows the reality, yet the uncertainty itself has become part of the story. As long as the diary remains private, its contents exist within the realm of possibility rather than fact, and that possibility carries its own form of power. A source within the inner circle remarked that institutions often find uncertainty more difficult to manage than criticism. Criticism can be addressed, contextualized, or eventually forgotten, but uncertainty lingers. It invites speculation. It allows observers to imagine scenarios that may or may not be true. In the case of Meghan's diary, the absence of clear information has allowed the object to acquire an almost symbolic status within the broader Sussex narrative. Of course, it would be simplistic to view the diary purely as a strategic tool. Personal journals are usually far more emotional than calculated. They reflect the writer's attempt to understand their own experiences rather than to influence public debate. According to someone close to palace circles, it is entirely possible that Meghan never intended those pages to serve any public purpose at all. They may simply represent a private record of a confusing and emotionally intense period in her life, a time when she was navigating the unfamiliar terrain of royal tradition while simultaneously confronting unprecedented media attention. Yet history has shown that private documents often acquire significance long after they are written. Letters between monarchs, journals kept by courtiers, even casual notes scribbled during moments of stress have later become valuable historical sources. They reveal the human emotions behind events that, in official records, appear distant and formal. And in the case of Meghan Markle, the emotional dimension of the Sussex story has always been central to public fascination. Someone behind closed doors described the situation with a hint of quiet irony. The monarchy, an institution defined by centuries of tradition, now finds itself navigating a modern world where personal narratives travel faster and further than ever before. Social media, streaming platforms, global publishing, all of these forces amplify individual voices in ways unimaginable only a generation ago. In such an environment, a simple diary written within the quiet rooms of Frogmore Cottage can suddenly feel like a document of immense potential significance. And so, the story continues to unfold in an atmosphere of quiet suspense. The diary remains unseen, its pages known only to the person who wrote them. The monarchy continues its public role, projecting stability and continuity as it has done for generations. Yet, somewhere beyond the palace gates, in a different corner of the world, sits a notebook that may contain one of the most personal accounts of modern royal life ever written. Whether it remains a private memory or eventually becomes part of the public narrative is a question that, for now, remains unanswered. But the possibility alone continues to hover gently over the royal story like a secret waiting patiently to be told. As the story reaches its final chapter, it becomes clear that Meghan Markle's rediscovered diary is about far more than a collection of handwritten reflections from her time at Frogmore Cottage. It has come to symbolize the unresolved tension between two powerful forces, the centuries-old traditions of the British monarchy and the modern world's appetite for deeply personal storytelling. According to someone close to palace circles, that tension now hangs quietly over the reign of King Charles III, not in the form of an immediate crisis, but as a lingering possibility, one of those unresolved threads in royal history that observers cannot quite stop discussing. King Charles ascended to the throne at a moment when the monarchy was already navigating a delicate transition. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II marked the end of an era defined by remarkable stability and continuity. Her reign stretched across generations, and for many people around the world, she represented the enduring face of the monarchy itself. Charles inherited not only the crown, but the immense responsibility of guiding the institution through a rapidly changing cultural landscape. A well-placed source observed that every monarch must balance tradition with adaptation, yet few have faced such a complex media environment as the one Charles now inhabits. Within that environment, the Sussex story continues to cast a long shadow. Prince Harry remains one of the most recognizable members of the royal family, even though he no longer performs official duties. Meghan Markle, meanwhile, has built a life far removed from palace protocol, operating within a global media culture where personal narratives carry enormous influence. According to a longtime family acquaintance, the emotional distance between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family has created an unusual dynamic. The monarchy continues its public role in Britain, while two of its most discussed figures live thousands of miles away, telling their own version of the story. This is where Meghan's diary enters the broader historical picture. The notebook itself may appear small and ordinary, yet its symbolic significance has grown with time. It represents a perspective on royal life that exists entirely outside palace control. Those pages, written privately during a period of intense personal and institutional conflict, may contain reflections that differ sharply from the carefully measured narrative the monarchy prefers to project. A source behind closed doors remarked that such documents are precisely the kind historians one day search for when attempting to understand what truly happened behind palace walls. At the same time, it would be a mistake to imagine that the monarchy lives in constant fear of such revelations. The institution has endured countless controversies over the centuries, many of them far more dramatic than modern observers sometimes realize. Scandals have erupted, memoirs have been written, private letters have surfaced decades later. Yet, through all of this, the monarchy has continued, adapting gradually while maintaining the essential structure of tradition. According to someone close to palace circles, the royal family understands that individual stories may come and go, but the institution itself operates on a far longer timeline. And yet the Sussex chapter feels different in one important respect. It unfolded during an era when global media can amplify personal narratives instantly and endlessly. A memoir becomes an international bestseller overnight. A documentary reaches millions of viewers across continents. A single interview can dominate public conversation for weeks. Within that landscape, the existence of Meghan's diary carries an undeniable intrigue. It suggests that the Sussex story may still contain personal insights that have not yet been shared. One can imagine the scene years from now, perhaps decades in the future, when historians attempt to reconstruct the emotional landscape of the early 21st century monarchy. They will examine official statements, newspaper archives, television interviews, and public speeches. But they will also search for something more intimate, documents that reveal how individuals experience those events from within. In that sense, Meghan's diary already holds historical value, regardless of whether its contents ever become public. Someone within the inner circle reflected on the situation with a kind of quiet perspective that seems almost philosophical. Royal history, after all, is rarely shaped by a single dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolds gradually, through the accumulation of personal decisions, family dynamics, and cultural shifts. The Sussex departure was one such moment, but it was also part of a much larger story about how the monarchy adapts to modern expectations. Meghan's diary, whether intentionally or not, may simply be another piece of that evolving narrative. For now, however, the notebook remains private, its pages closed, its contents known only to the woman who wrote them during those turbulent months at Frogmore Cottage. The palace continues its duties. King Charles carries forward the responsibilities of the crown. Prince William prepares for the role he will one day inherit, and far away in California, the Sussexes continue shaping their own path beyond the boundaries of royal tradition. The story, in other words, remains unfinished, and perhaps that is the most fascinating aspect of all. Royal history often appears fixed and ceremonial, yet behind the formality lie human emotions, personal memories, and experiences that rarely reach the public eye. Meghan Markle's diary reminds us that even within the most ancient institutions, the private thoughts of individuals can carry extraordinary significance. Whether those thoughts remain locked safely within a notebook or eventually emerge as part of the public narrative will depend entirely on decisions yet to be made. For now, the pages remain closed, but the curiosity surrounding them has only grown stronger with time. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and if you value this calm, unvarnished look behind the palace curtains, do make sure you are subscribed, give the video a like, and share it with others who appreciate thoughtful conversations about the monarchy and the stories that shape it.